If you have any questions, please come and see me. My voice and throat are kind of torn up, so I'd rather do this once, and you guys can watch it and pause it where you need to. So let's take a look at this. We have some things going on here, and we want to do practices of Vietnam again, so you can compare and contrast against Cuba and against Chinese Civil War. So we do have a brief little something. We have a brief video that I'm going to see if we'll play. Pay attention. This is on how the war's starting. It's going to go over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's going to go over strategic bombing. So let's take some notes on this.
The firebase here at Con Chin was in the front line of America's war against communism to prevent the communist North taking over the South. Con Chin was one of a chain of U.S. artillery bases just south of the border. Here's the base right here. And here's the border, with a kind of no man's land either side of it called the Demilitarized Zone. The Demilitarized Zone literally cut Vietnam in half. Down here was South Vietnam, a fragile republic governed by a military elite whose army needed America's help. Their capital was Saigon. The whole of Vietnam, north and south, is 1,000 miles from bottom to top. Up here, communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and leading it, in its capital Hanoi, the lifelong communist and ardent nationalist Ho Chi Minh. Known as Uncle Ho to his followers, Ho Chi Minh had trained and equipped an army of 500,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. Ho had successfully driven out the French colonial government in 1954, and now he was resolved to push out the Americans and reunite Vietnam under communism. The Americans were led by General William Westmoreland. With a clutch of medals from World War II and Korea, Westmoreland now led an American force of 500,000 troops in support of some 800,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. But the challenge faced by General Westmoreland and his men was all the greater because they didn't just have one enemy, they had two. As well as a threat from the north, the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies had to face thousands of local communist guerrillas here inside South Vietnam itself. The Southern Communist rebels called themselves the National Liberation Front, but history remembers them by the name the Americans used, the Viet Cong, VC. They were a huge problem for the US troops. With no uniforms to distinguish them from the other villages in South Vietnam, it was very difficult to tell who was friend and who was foe. Yeah, you Viet Cong, huh? You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong. Half the time, the Americans were fighting an enemy they just couldn't pin down. But the Viet Cong's ability to blend in was not their only advantage. They were also supplied by their powerful ally and effective controller in the north, Ho Chi Minh. The lifeline he set up to supply the Viet Cong was an incredible logistical feat. He sent North Vietnamese fighters, arms and equipment down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of unpaved roads and paths stretching hundreds of miles down the length of Vietnam. It was largely concealed in the jungle, just across the border, in supposedly neutral countries next door. I traveled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail twice. We literally had to hike or crawl our way through the jungle. Some people would carry up to 80 kilos on their shoulders. There were even some hill tribespeople who would carry up to 90 kilos, which for the women was more than their own body weight. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was vital to the communist war effort, and the weapon the United States deployed against it was the might of its air firepower. Some of the bombing targets were strategic points in North Vietnam, railways, bridges, factories, and so on. Another target for the bombers, including giant B-52s, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans hoped their bombing would cut off the lifeblood of the rebels of the South. Just one of these B-52s could drop over 100 bombs and devastate an area a mile long by a quarter of a mile wide. In South Vietnam, the bombers would act on intelligence reports and try to hit Viet Cong's strongholds. High explosive bombs and napalm, an extremely flammable liquid, caused terrible destruction. And much of the countryside, on which so many depended, was laid to waste. These bombs may have been hitting their targets, but they weren't doing much to win over the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. Often, the targets were in or near populated villages, so inevitably, civilians were killed. Also, it wasn't really a very good way of rooting out the communists. To do that, there was really no alternative but to go in on foot.
Okay, so what we have there, again, is just a little overview of visual. So, when we look at the practices of war, the United States is basically going to do what the United States will do from World War II to Korea. They've never really had to fight what's called asymmetrically. Asymmetrically, or they would have, or we're talking guerrilla fighter force. They did out in the West in the late 1800s against the Native Americans. They did in the Philippines, but these were small little things. Remember, the United States really comes of age in World War II. They used tactics that were used in the American Civil War. A lot of American strategy comes from Ulysses Grant, comes from Sherman, comes from Sheridan, if you know who I'm talking about, and they're a destructive way of just marching through and destroying the enemy. So that carried over to World War II. It defeated the Nazis, it defeated the Japanese, carried over to Korea. While it wasn't super successful, it did halt the Chinese advance into South Korea. So now they're going to Vietnam, and they're going, well, here's what worked, let's do it. Superior air power. You're going to go in, you're going to fight forces, and when things get bad, you're going to call in air power. Or you are definitely going to strategically bomb the crap out of the enemy. Now, we talked about how much bombs were dropped on the north. When you combine that with the amount of bombs that were dropped in the south, the tonnage went over World War II. So the tonnage of bombs dropped on Vietnam as a whole, north and south, Cambodia and Laos, overtake the amount of bombs dropped during all of World War II. So they used quite a bit of strategic air power. They will engage in search and destroy missions. The thing to know, again, is they're going to have to play this to the American public. Search and destroy doesn't sound good when you're going into villages, so you will start hearing about these things called sweep and clears. They're the exact same thing. They're just trying to play up the role to the American public. You're going to have to do patrols at night because that's when the Viet Cong are going to be doing their nastiness. It will be a war of attrition. What they're trying, but they are trying to destroy as many of the enemy as possible. The big problem becomes, as your reading explains, is they're not holding any land. Remember, the people that will be fighting the Vietnam War are the people that grew up on watching World War II unfold, on watching Korea unfold, and the way that you knew what was going on, the way that you figured out how well your brother or your sister or your cousin or whoever might be doing is you watch the news or you watch video clips at the movies, and you saw things like, and the U.S. has landed at D-Day, and the U.S. is progressing through France, and the U.S. is getting into Germany. So you as an American public can see this happening. The American public is completely confused of, wait, we're fighting an enemy, and we're not going anywhere. We're not invading the North. We're not pushing the communists out. They are very, very confused. So again, the reading said they come up with this idea of body counts. The United States only lost 13 people in this battle, but the communists lost 600. So you're going to measure in body counts. And For a while, this works, but then things start coming to light, and people are going to question this body count efficacy. They're going to say, wait a minute, what exactly are those bodies you're killing? Especially after things like My Lai, which we're going to get to, and you're going to get to with effects in your reading. So what are the North Vietnamese going to do? They're going to follow typical Revolutionary War tactics. They are going to hit and run. They are going to improvise a gigantic tunnel network. It's going to be one of the biggest tunnel networks in the history of warfare. There's a guy that used to be a chef called Anthony Bourdain. Some of you might know him. He has a show called Without Boundaries or something on CNN. I watch it almost every week. One of those, recently actually, I think this season, he went to Hue City. So if you read the last reading, or you read this reading, Hue City was what happened during Tet, the siege of Hue. Well, he went there and he went and visited a gentleman from a village to, sample food and talk about culture. That's what the show's all about. And he visited a village, the tunnel network, the entire village for the duration of the end of the Vietnam War moved underground. I think he said it was about 3 years. The entire village, men, women, children, lived underground. The men would come out of the tunnel at night and go fight and come back. You're raising families, you're having kids play in these tunnel networks while you're fighting the Americans, because the tunnels are what's going to protect you from the air power of the United States. Again, ambushes, booby traps. One of the biggest booby traps against the United States was actually this thing called punji sticks. They take bamboo, they cut them so they're razor sharp. They put them in pits. So you have punji pits. You'll cover them with a little grass, and as American soldiers are walking down paths doing these sweep and clears or these patrols, they'll step in these holes, they'll slice their foot, some of the punji sticks will go straight through their feet, and you will now immobilize an entire squad or an entire platoon because of these very simplistic but effective booby traps. So these are the things American servicemen are going to have to watch out for. They're going to fight in the countryside. Very rarely are they going to fight in cities, except for Tet. They're going to use the Ho Chi Minh Trail extremely efficiently. That video did a very good job of showing that the Ho Chi Minh Trail, majority of land ran through Cambodia and Laos, which at the time were said to be non-combatants, neutral countries. They really weren't. They have this idea of acceptable losses. So what will happen is the Vietnamese commanders will have this idea of, okay, we're going to go battle these Americans. We can only lose 100 troops. So they'll run in and they'll fight and they'll take out as many Americans. They'll wound or kill as many Americans as possible. And when that acceptable loss number of 100, they run back to Laos or Cambodia or back into their tunnel network. So Americans are losing men. They think they're winning the body count battle, but the Vietnamese know exactly what their losses are. So again, it's this weird thing of body counts that will actually come back and bite American commanders in the butt. And you will also have the Viet Cong. Viet Cong will be the guerrilla network in the South. It is a guerrilla tactic. It is modeled after Mao. It is definitely adapted by Ho and Gape. But it is 100% coming directly from Mao, just like we learned Cuba did. They adapted it a little to fit their country. That's what Mao would actually tell you. You have to have a commander smart enough to adapt it to your individual situation. So that's what Ho Chi Minh does. That's what Vo Nguyen Gape does. That's what Che does. So again, we review Mao's ideas that will become North Vietnamese ideas. You got to make it a long struggle, and this must be understood by everyone involved. This isn't going to be quick. We don't have the firepower that the other side has. We don't have the array of weapons, the array of technology. So we got to do what we can do, but it's going to be long, so everybody hunker down and get ready for this. They will do all the stuff that we learned in the Chinese Civil War and that we learned for Cuba. Again, we saw that surprise attacks, attack communications and the supplies, destroy the ability to move those supply lines, those punji sticks. Everything we've learned will be adapted to fit the Vietnamese. The goal is to extend the conflict so you just wear down the enemy. Because Mao will always tell you, just like Clausewitz will tell you, that war is really about politics, and you want to extend the conflict and exhaust the people in power. The big thing that Mao says, and the one big thing that will be taken from Mao to Ho and Vo Nguyen Gape is the idea of trading space for time, and they will do that a lot. Again, the Americans will never hold any ground. There's this thing this guy named Victor Davis Hanson said. It's called the Western Way of War. Think of Avatar for anybody who's seen it. That last battle in the movie Avatar, where the bad guys, the Marines, land and they line up, on a big line, and they start marching forward and shooting, and with all their artillery and all their, their aircraft behind them, shooting at, the whatever they were called in Avatar, the Avatars. But the Avatars were running around fighting in nature and everything. There is a concept called the Western Way of War, that's how Americans fight. That's how the West fights. They fight in these things called pitched battles. So Americans and the West would want to get into these pitched battles where they can use their superior technology to take out the enemy. And in this one giant battle, you get supremacy. You can think of things like D-Day. You can think of things like Midway. You have this one pitched battle where you face off against each other, and there you go. That's not what guerrilla fighters want to do. They want to completely flip that. They do not want a pitched battle. They want to stay away from that because they know if they lined up against them, they'd be toast. So you trade space. Every time the United States comes in, think of Hamburger Hill that you read about. Think of Hill, I think it was 875. The Americans will spend a couple days, lives, effort, supplies. You'll end up with a couple hundred Americans killed, dead, or wounded. And what do you end up with? They get to the top of the hill. They look around. There's no VC there. There's no North Vietnamese there. So they literally just turn around and give up the land because the Vietnamese were willing to just trade land for time. So the longer the time, the better. Now, what Mao will tell you, and this happened in the Chinese Civil War. It happened a little bit in Cuba. And there's people that want this to happen in the Vietnamese war against the Americans. The whole reason for guerrilla warfare is you wear out the enemy to the point where your guerrilla forces are now actually stronger than the enemy. Now you switch it, call it beast mode, whatever, but you switch it to where your military now attacks them in the exact battle that they've been looking for, but now they're too weak to fight it. Think Dien Bien Phu. That's the battle where, Gates flips it on them, and that's really what eventually the Vietnamese want to do. That's what Tet is. Tet is when they think they've worn the Americans out. They haven't. They're wrong. Luckily, though, Tet is what it is, which we'll get to. So again, why are they doing this? They're looking to bleed support. They're looking to bleed the money, bleed the material, bleed the men. They're really looking to bleed the support at home from the population and from the government officials. So when you look at what the Vietnamese did against French, it worked wonderfully. They fought. Eventually, Dien Bien Phu happened. It wasn't that the French were completely beaten. The French could have sent more soldiers. The French could have kept the fight up. But in Paris, the government officials were tired of it. The French public was tired of it. Dien Bien Phu just made them go, you know what? We're done. You can have it. It's not worth our time and effort. That's what they're looking to do. That's what the guerrilla fighter is looking to do, especially in the Vietnam War. Remember, Chinese Civil War, Chinese against Chinese. Cuban Civil War, Cuban Revolution, Cuba versus Cuba. Right now, is this a revolutionary war? Yes, it is Vietnamese against Vietnamese. But it is definitely a people fighting against a larger, superior Western force in the United States. So they want to bleed that support. It worked against the French. They're going to try it against the Americans. Tet is the time they try and switch into beast mode, and it doesn't work. So when we look at what's going on here, they always make sure, Ho and Gape always make sure politics are in the front of the war against the Americans. They think, remember guys, remember what we did last time in causes. Vietnamese has been a conquered people. They were conquered by the Chinese, they were conquered by the Japanese, they were conquered by the French. Now here's the U.S. They just see the U.S. as one long line of conquerors. They always will make sure against all these conquerors that politics is out in the front. Ho will actually appeal to the American people directly. Remember, he models the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam off of the American Declaration of Independence. So he's constantly appealing to the American people. He actually writes a letter addressed to the American people in the early 60s. The American response is, again, what do? They use the Western Way of War. They bomb them. They use the air cavalry, guys. Air cavalry is, think helicopters replace horses. Okay, you pile a bunch of soldiers in a helicopter, and now you're air mobile. You can jump in, jump out of places, and they figure this is the way to fight the Vietnamese War because you're going to be fighting in jungles. You're going to use air power. You're going to take hills that are worthless. You're going to bomb some more. You're going to have these fire bases that was talked about in the beginning of that video. Why the fire bases are there is when you go out on patrol, the goal is to fight the Vietnamese. You find them, then you call in artillery support, you call in air support. The Vietnamese get wise to that. There will be orders given from a lot of Vietnamese commanders that says, don't shoot your weapons until you're among them. So they can't use their superior artillery. We talked about the sweep and clears. And again, the Vietnamese response is patience, like with the French. They will trade space for time until the Tet Offensive. And again, guys, we will get into the specifics of Tet later in this PowerPoint. But remember, you now are educated, unlike most of the American public, about the Vietnamese War. Tet is an absolute positive U.S. military victory. It establishes the fact the United States pretty much wipes out the Viet Cong as an organization. They're gone. But what does it do? It is boo U.S. military. It shows the public that maybe they've been lied to. Maybe this war is going to go on for a lot longer than they thought. So, like in Paris, Tet is making patience run out in Washington. So you got to remember that. So now let's look at some other practices of war. You got Operation Ranch Hand, which runs from 61 to 71. You'll read about this in your new reading because it is an effect. Agent Orange is what's called a defoliant. Okay. There's also this stuff called Agent Blue, which is like a weed killer, basically. But basically, you're having planes fly over for 10 years and try and destroy the jungle, and it does a pretty good job. What it also does is, even today, there are birth defects. There's a lot of health issues of Vietnamese people because of the giant spraying of Agent Orange. They're trying to clear the jungle out so the American fighters can do what they want to do. Soldiers will come home, and American soldiers will have problems because of Agent Orange. You also have napalm. Napalm, imagine mixing concentrated orange juice with gasoline, lighting it on fire, then throwing it on someone. You're not getting it off because it's sticking. It is some nasty stuff, but they use it a lot. And you saw this picture. Remember, that's the outcome of napalm. It's going to go against the American public because it's going to show the disaster of napalm. 68's a big year. Guys, 68's a big year. It could be called the turning point in a lot of things, but definitely the turning point of the American war in Vietnam, because first off, the Tet Offensive. Again, remember, you write this one down. The Tet Offensive is the turning point of the war. It shows the American public that maybe they've been lied to, even though it's a military victory. You also have a bunch of things. This is a tumultuous period in American history. Okay, you saw the Vietnamese execution photo. I showed you that. That gets circulated. We will talk about further in this presentation the My Lai massacre. That's a problem. Johnson decides not to run for president because of all this crap happening. He figures he's not going to get the support. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in 68. Robert Kennedy is assassinated in this year. Nixon comes in as president, running on a platform to get us out of Vietnam. And there's a manned Apollo 8 mission, which, again, just shows you how much is going on this year. Very tumultuous time. And what's happening because of all this? So you got the public getting crazy because of this, the public getting crazy because of this. The credibility gap widens on the American government. The credibility gap is going to be this thing that's shifting. You're having everybody believes their government in this country. We remember American exceptionalism in the Cold War. We are the best in the world. Americans believe that. Well, now in 68, Americans are going, wait, we won World War II, we had that Korea thing, we're in Vietnam, we've been told we're winning. We're not winning. What is winning? So that's called the credibility gap, and it really flips America on its head for a lot of years. Really, people would say the Vietnam hangover lasts until the Gulf War in 91. Many people, many political scientists would tell you that the Vietnam War's hangover politically in this country's foreign policy lasted until 9/11. So Vietnam's a big deal, guys. It affects your life, believe it or not. You have Khe Sanh, which is a change of tactics of the Vietnamese. They, not to go a long thing here, but it's a siege. They try and siege the city of Khe Sanh. The Marines have to go clear it out. And again, it's a victory, but it's a hard-fought victory that shows the American public, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's the execution photo we saw, again, changing the American public's mind. Tet Offensive, guys, make a long story short, the Lunar New Year is the Tet holiday in Vietnam. There's a ceasefire in the Vietnam War every single year on Tet. You have the siege at Khe Sanh. You have the siege at Hue. Now you have the ARVN and the U.S. looking to be caught off guard. What you got going on here is you have the Lunar New Year at Tet. One person described it as imagine wrapping up Christmas, New Year's, Halloween, Thanksgiving into one holiday. That's what Tet is to the Vietnamese. So what's going to happen is the NVA and the Viet Cong are going to coordinate attacks by getting weapons ready for about 6 months, and they're going to have a coordinated attack across all of South Vietnam pretty much. You're going to have all kinds of capitals, all kinds of cities, all kinds of hamlets attacked on the same time. You're going to have them raiding the U.S. Embassy. You're going to have Saigon's airport, presidential palace, and military headquarters hit. It is a giant offensive, meaning the Viet Cong is going on the offensive like the Vietnamese did at Dien Bien Phu. Again, the result is a staggering U.S. victory. Ceases to exist. The Viet Cong ceased to exist. But what does it show the American public? Remember, this is the first televised war. Now, today, news is no big deal. Nobody even watches the news because of the 24-hour news cycle. But remember, in the 60s, this is the advent of the television age. Every night after dinner, families of all ages, yes, even you teenagers, would sit down and watch the evening news. It was a family event to watch the evening news and find out what was going on. So what happens here? You've been fighting this war for 4 years, been told you're winning, been told the body counts. Well, now all of a sudden, families are gathering around the TV every night after dinner, and they are seeing this massive offensive killing American soldiers. So they don't want to hear it's a military victory. They want to hear how the Vietnamese was able to do this. I think it proves we've been lied to is what they're going to say. So that is what we got going on. There's everything I just said. The Americans have been saying this is a winnable war. Not only is it winnable, but we are winning. We are winning. The Tet Offensive is a major defeat for the NVA. It's a major defeat for the Viet Cong. But it is an absolutely political, social defeat for the U.S. It is a disaster. It makes them question what the war is doing. It makes them question their support of the war. Now, guys, when it says sway public opinion, understand the statistics are the majority of the United States still support the war. But what happens after the Tet Offensive is you go like 20% of the American public doesn't like the war in Vietnam to like 48% don't like. So, guys, you're talking, yes, there was still a statistical percentage that the Americans were still in support, but it is a gigantic leap. So what does Westmoreland do? Say, we got to expand this into Laos and Cambodia. This is the last thing the American public want to hear is expand this war that they've been told they're winning, and now it seems like we're not really winning. So, guys, remember that thing, the nightly news was people gathered around it every night. This is the kind of thing they're hearing from American reporters. This is a primary source.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victims, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
Okay, so there you go. Now, again, what else comes out in this year? You have Tet turning the American public opinion. Again, Tet is the huge turning point. What doesn't help? The My Lai massacre. Guys, what you have to understand, and I'm going to just put all this up so you can copy it, and just copy what you need. But what you got to understand is by this time, by late 68, most of the career military men were gone. Most of your really good, effective officers are gone. You're rotating in brand new officers out of ROTC. They're very rah-rah. They've been trained to be rah-rah, and they're rotating in with dudes who are seasoned veterans. Some guys, remember, a tour was 1 year. Let's be honest here. There were people who did multiple tours. You'll hear of soldiers doing 4 and 5 tours in Nam because they felt like it was their duty. So you're going in with people who are seasoned, even if they haven't been seasoned, even if they are your 1 year grunts, they were called, your FNGs, they were called. By 6 months, they know what's going on in Vietnam. They know how to fight this war. Well, you get these commanders in there that are all rah-rah and gung-ho, and now this shatters unit integrity. And now people are just tiring of the war. So you get commanders that are not seasoned. You get very, very bad unit integrity, and it's just a bad scene. So what happens? Make a long story short, in March of '68, American soldiers are on one of those sweep and clear missions. They hit the My Lai village, the My Lai hamlet it's called, and what happens is they search for the Vietnamese. But guys, remember, this is a guerrilla war. Just like every other guerrilla war, when American soldiers come tromping through the woods, there's a signal to tell them they're coming. The men who are the fighters clear out. You're left with men, women, and children, and old people. Okay? So what happens is this. You get these kind of images. You get little kids if you look in the background. You get babies if you look off to the left. You get women. You see all these children. Look at all the children. And you're talking, there's an infant in the foreground. Again, guys, as a father, I'll tell you right now, this would be tough for me to take. And this is going to be tough for the American public to take. And what you don't also know is this is the kind of photos that we're on. Off to the side, there's a mass grave with about another 200 of people that look exactly like this. So this is a problem. It gets reported in November, but what they basically say, and they think this is going to help. They think, hey, listen. Most of the good soldiers have been rotated out or retired. A lot have died. So we're getting draftees that was questionable. And what that does now is now makes everyone question the draft, which has already been questioned because of its socioeconomic problems, the inequity it created among races especially. So now we move on. So now Johnson sees all these problems. He's out. Nixon comes in. He runs on the idea that he's going to end the Vietnam War. But in private, he doesn't believe we should end the war on any terms but us as victors, let's say. So first thing he does, big term, is Vietnamization. He vows to end the war. So what he basically says is we will slowly turn over the war to the Vietnamese. Imagine a platoon of soldiers training a platoon of soldiers of South Vietnamese, and then that platoon of U.S. soldiers rotates out of the country. The South Vietnamese soldiers take over. It's actually not a bad plan. By August of '69, you have 25,000 home. By 1972, America is effectively out of the war, and the South Vietnamese are effectively fighting pretty well. Here's the thing to understand. I'll just go back for 1 second. Guys, the thing to understand here is the South Vietnamese people are actually fighting pretty well. The problem becomes it's going to take around $2.5 billion, $3 billion to run this army, to run this fight for the South Vietnamese. The Americans that are funding the war, South Vietnamese people don't have $3 billion laying around to fund this war like the United States did. So the problem is not, and you will hear some historians or some people say, well, when we turned the war over, the Vietnamese sucked. No, the Vietnamese were actually fighting pretty well. Problem becomes they couldn't fund the war. So Vietnamization included troop allocations, but the Vietnamese war also included some funding. The funding dried up very quickly. When we deal with peace with honor, this is another Nixon thing. He just wants to say that we are going to have peace, but we're an honorable people. So we want to save face basically in the war. What's going to happen is Nixon says we want to have peace with honor, but he is going to routinely increase the war. You have the bombings of Laos and Cambodia. You have the extension of the war. You have the Christmas offensive, which is Americans going into the offensive again. And this is happening all along the way. He's saying Vietnamization and peace with honor. Because this comes to public knowledge, this is what's going to cause the War Powers Act to take power back. He's also going to try this thing called the madman theory. Literally, he acts like a lunatic with his finger on the button of a nuclear weapon. He piles nuclear bombs into B-52 bombers, and he sends them at China. He sends them at the Soviets and turns them around at the last minute. He's trying to force the Soviets and the Chinese to go to Ho Chi Minh and say, listen, go negotiate with these guys. He's a lunatic. I don't know what he's going to do. He might drop a nuclear bomb on you. Yeah, it's not really a great theory. Yeah, there's a great picture of Nixon. Yeah, not a great idea. Let's do that. He is expanding the war in '70. He expands the war into Cambodia and Laos, saying that this is what's going to work. They're sneaking across the borders. All this does is cause an outburst across the country. This is actually going to cause the outburst at colleges also. So guys, again, be careful what you say of the Vietnam protest. The Vietnam college protest, the youth protests, were actually because of the expansion of the war into Laos and Cambodia. That's where you're going to get Kent State. That's where you're going to get Jackson State. Okay, it's called the Kent State Massacre. You have National Guardsmen come out. They fire in the crowds of people. At Kent State, you're going to have 4 killed, 9 wounded. At Jackson State, you're going to have 12 wounded and 2 killed. So you're going to have 6 Americans killed, 6 college students killed at home because of this war. Now remember, it's not because of necessarily the Vietnam War. It's because of the expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos. And there's an extremely famous photo again from the Vietnam era of what's happening at Kent State. This photo is from Kent State. Again, now the war and after 68 is going to be expanding into culture. We're going to have expanding into books, into novels. We're going to have expanding into music. Here's a song by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young called Ohio. Kent State's in Ohio, guys. This is about the war in Vietnam, Cambodia, I should say. This is about the expansion into Cambodia, and this is about the Kent State Massacre, it's called. So now you're going to have other songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. That's anti-draft, things like that. And that's just a bad scene. At the end of the day, here's what happens. Pentagon Papers get released in the late 70s. It's a bunch of private papers of the Lyndon Johnson administration. And basically, it confirms what Americans believed for a long time, is that the government wasn't honest with them. And it creates this giant credibility gap that actually persists through the 70s and the 80s. So you can take notes on this, but it's really that while the whole time they were saying the war was maybe not a great idea, or we're winning the war, or we're doing this to the war, that what they were saying to the American public, the Pentagon Papers prove that they were saying the exact opposite. Guys, I'm sorry, I know it was a long one, but there was a lot of stuff we had to get in. Remember, we're making this a mini unit, so imagine this was like all of World War II, the thing you did for like 20 days, wrapped up into whatever time this took. Thanks, and I'll see you when you're done.